She called the cops to enforce her HOA rules, never realizing the man she confronted answered to federal law, not her clipboard. The lake existed long before the HOA ever did. It was quiet, wide, and still, hidden behind rows of newly built homes with identical fences and identical rules. Every morning before sunrise, I stood at its edge, fishing rod in hand, enjoying the only silence left in the neighborhood. The lake wasn't HOA property. It was federal land. That small detail would soon matter more than Karen could ever imagine. Karen first approached me with a clipboard, the kind held like a weapon by people who believe paper grants power. Her blonde hair was pulled so tight it looked like it hurt, sunglasses oversized and mirrored, reflecting back the lake, the dock, and me like evidence she planned to submit later. She didn't say hello. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't introduce herself like a normal human being encountering another adult in public space. She stopped 3 feet from me, squared her shoulders, and spoke as if the conversation had already been decided. "This lake is under HOA control," she announced, tapping the clipboard with a manicured finger for emphasis. "Residents need a permit. Fishing is prohibited." There was no room in her tone for disagreement, only compliance. I looked up from the water slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable, then calmly replied, "No, it is." The word landed like an insult. She blinked once hard as if she'd misheard, as if the universe itself had malfunctioned by allowing someone to say no to her. Her lips parted slightly, then pressed together in offense. "Excuse me," she said. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I didn't explain myself yet. I just reeled in a few inches of line, adjusted my grip, and said evenly, 'This lake isn't under HOA control.'" Her posture stiffened. Sunglasses tilted down a fraction, revealing narrowed eyes scanning me head to toe, measuring, judging, dismissing. "I'm the HOA president," she snapped, stressing every syllable like a title that should trigger applause or fear. The words clearly meant a lot to her. They meant nothing to me. "And I'm still fishing," I replied, casting my line back into the water with a smooth flick that made her flinch. The lure hit the surface with a soft plop, ripples spreading outward, indifferent to her authority. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by something sharper and meaner. The polite mask cracked, revealing irritation that bordered on rage. "You can't do that," she said, voice rising, volume compensating for lack of substance. "The rules are very clear." She flipped the clipboard toward me, pages fluttering, laminated notices and printed bylaws highlighted in angry neon colors. I didn't even look at them. "Those rules don't apply here," I said. She scoffed, a short laugh filled with disbelief. "They apply to everyone," she insisted. "That's what an HOA is." I finally met her eyes. "Not to public water," I said. That's when her confidence wavered just slightly, the way it does when someone encounters resistance they didn't prepare for. She recovered fast, though, drawing herself up taller. "This is a private community," she declared. "That makes this a private lake." I shook my head. "No, it doesn't." Each correction seemed to wound her personally. You could see it in the tightening of her jaw, the whitening of her knuckles around the clipboard. People like her don't hear facts, they hear challenges. "I've lived here for 12 years, she said, as if longevity replaced legality. "I know what I'm talking about." "So have the fish," I said, eyes back on the water. Her mouth fell open for half a second before snapping shut. "You're being deliberately difficult," she accused. "I'm being accurate," I replied. The lake was quiet except for birds and the soft lap of water against the dock, a calm backdrop to her escalating frustration. She paced a step left, then right, like a general deciding whether to order an attack. "If you don't leave immediately," she warned, "I will call the authorities." I smiled then, just a little, not out of mockery but out of certainty. "You're welcome to," I said. That smile infuriated her more than any argument could have. "Don't threaten me," she snapped. "I'm not," I said. "I'm inviting you." She stared at me, searching for hesitation, fear, anything she could exploit. She found none. Around us, a couple of neighbors slowed their walks, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood. Karen noticed them too and straightened, performing authority now, voice loud enough to be overheard. "This man is violating HOA regulations," she announced to no one in particular. "I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect." I remained seated, relaxed, fishing rod steady, as if none of it concerned me. That contrast drove her mad. "Last chance," she hissed, leaning in. "Pack up and leave." I looked up once more, calm and unbothered. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, her face flushed red beneath the sunglasses. "Fine," she said sharply. "You brought this on yourself." She spun on her heel and marched away, phone already in her hand, thumbs flying as she dialed, confidence restored by the belief that backup was coming. I watched her go, listening to the water, waiting patiently, knowing that Chapter 3 was about to write itself. Karen stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, sharp and overconfident, the kind people wear when they want to be noticed and feared at the same time. Her voice rose deliberately, projected outward like a public announcement, calibrated so the nearby joggers, dog walkers, and curious neighbors slowing their steps would all hear every word. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police," she warned, pointing her phone at me like it was already a weapon. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control and humiliation. She wanted an audience. She wanted witnesses. She wanted to prove that she could summon authority with a single tap of her finger. I nodded once, slow and calm, the way you do when you've already thought 10 steps ahead. "Go ahead," I said. The words were quiet, almost bored, and that's what caught her off guard. She expected panic, excuses, bargaining, maybe anger. Most people fold the moment police are mentioned. Karen lived off that reflex. She thrived on it, but my response didn't feed her power, it starved it. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker across her face. Her eyebrows twitched behind the sunglasses. "Excuse me," she said, not because she hadn't heard me, but because she needed a redo, a version of reality where I backed down. "I said call them," I repeated, eyes still on the water. That was when her jaw tightened. The threat hadn't worked, and that offended her more deeply than defiance itself. She glanced around, confirming the small crowd that had gathered, then squared her shoulders again, performance mode activated. "You are trespassing," she declared loudly. "You are violating HOA property and refusing lawful orders." Every word was chosen to sound official, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her yet. I simply adjusted my grip on the rod and waited. That silence unnerved her. "This is harassment," she continued, now warming to the sound of her own authority, "and I will not tolerate intimidation in my community." My community. The phrase slipped out naturally, possessive and absolute. She finally pulled the phone fully to her ear, thumb hovering over the screen. "You still have time to leave," she said, lowering her voice, trying one last private warning. I looked up at her then, really looked, and met her gaze without blinking. "So do you?" I said. That did it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned slightly away from me, angling the phone, and tapped the screen with a sharp, decisive motion. "Yes, hello," she said loudly. "I need the police at the lake immediately." She paced as she spoke, voice growing more dramatic by the sentence. "There's a man here refusing to comply with HOA regulations. He's being aggressive and disruptive." Aggressive, disruptive. I sat silently on a wooden dock fishing. One of the joggers frowned. A woman walking her dog slowed to a stop. Karen noticed and leaned into it. "Yes, I feel unsafe," she added, eyes flicking toward me. "He's ignoring lawful instructions and trespassing on private property." I almost laughed at that one, but instead I stayed still. Let her talk. Let her build her story. People like Karen always overplay their hand. "I'm the HOA president," she continued, as if repeating the title enough times would make it legally binding. "Yes, I'll wait." She lowered the phone and shot me a triumphant look, chin lifted, lips curling into a satisfied half-smile. "They're on their way," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This didn't have to happen." "It still doesn't," I replied calmly. Her smile vanished again. "You had your chance," she snapped. She stepped back now, arms crossed, phone still in hand, eyes glued to me like she expected me to bolt at any second. Minutes passed. The lake remained calm. The fish didn't care. The small crowd grew, whispers passing between strangers as Karen filled the silence with commentary. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Some people think rules don't apply to them." She shook her head theatrically. "I won't let this neighborhood turn into chaos." I wondered briefly how many times she'd done this before, how many people she'd bullied into submission with threats and volume alone. The answer was probably a lot. That's why she was so confident now. That's why she hadn't noticed she'd already lost control of the situation. A distant siren finally cut through the air, faint but unmistakable. Karen straightened instantly, vindication written all over her posture. "There," she said, pointing toward the road. "Justice." She turned to the onlookers. "This is what happens when you challenge authority." I reeled in my lines slowly and set the rod down beside me, standing for the first time. Karen took an instinctive step back, then caught herself, lifting her chin defiantly. "Don't you dare try to leave now," she warned. "Stay right there." I smiled again, small and patient. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees. Karen's breathing quickened, excitement mixing with anticipation. She was already rehearsing the moment in her head, the officers backing her up, me being scolded or escorted away, her authority reaffirmed in front of witnesses. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that she had just escalated the situation past the point of control, and once the police arrived, this wouldn't be her stage anymore. 2 patrol cars rolled in 10 minutes later, tires crunching softly on gravel, red and blue lights flashing against the calm surface of the lake like something invasive and unnecessary. The peaceful morning fractured instantly. Birds scattered. Conversations stopped. Karen practically floated toward the cars, positioning herself beside them like a co-star who'd finally reached her big scene. Arms crossed, chin lifted, she launched into her explanation before the officers had even shut their doors. Her voice was fast, clipped, confident, a practiced monologue filled with buzzwords and exaggerations. "He's trespassing," she said sharply, gesturing at me without looking, "harassing residents, violating HOA bylaws, refusing lawful instructions, creating a disturbance." Each accusation stacked neatly on top of the last, her head nodding as if she were confirming facts rather than inventing them. One officer listened politely, not reacting, while the other scanned the scene, eyes moving from Karen to the small crowd to me standing quietly by the dock. Karen kept talking, feeding off her own momentum. "I warned him repeatedly," she insisted. "He was aggressive. He made me feel unsafe." She said that one louder, glancing at the onlookers to make sure they heard. The officer nearest her raised a hand gently, stopping the flow. "All right, ma'am," he said calmly. "We'll speak with him." Karen stepped back but not far, planting herself close enough to watch every second. She folded her arms tighter, lips curling into a satisfied smile that said she'd already decided the ending. The second officer approached me, boots steady on the dock boards, posture neutral, professional. "Sir," he said evenly, "we're going to need you to step away from the lake for a moment." His tone wasn't aggressive, just procedural, the voice of someone used to sorting out half-truths between strangers. I nodded once, acknowledging him, and reached calmly into my jacket. Karen's smile widened instantly. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. Her eyes lit up with anticipation, already imagining handcuffs, embarrassment, validation. To her, the motion looked like panic or compliance, or maybe something worse. She leaned slightly toward the officers, breath held, ready to watch authority crush defiance. My fingers closed around the leather edge inside my jacket, movement slow, deliberate, unhurried. The officer noticed the change and shifted his stance subtly, hand hovering near his belt, eyes alert but not alarmed. "Sir," he said carefully, "what are you reaching for?" "Identification," I replied calmly. Karen let out a soft, smug exhale, barely containing herself. This was it. This was the collapse she'd predicted. I withdrew my hand and held up the badge, angled so the officer could see it clearly before I said a word. The change was immediate. The officer's eyes dropped to the badge, then snapped back up to my face, posture straightening so fast it was almost mechanical. His expression shifted from casual authority to focused recognition in less than a second. "One moment," he said quietly, taking the badge with both hands, inspecting it carefully. The other officer noticed the shift and stepped closer, glancing down as well. Karen was still smiling, still confident, still completely unaware. "See," she said, unable to stop herself. "I told you he—" Her voice cut off mid-sentence. She noticed the officers weren't listening anymore. She noticed the way their body language had changed, the way the conversation had stopped being about her. The first officer handed the badge back to me respectfully. "Thank you, sir," he said, voice noticeably different now. "Apologies for the interruption." Karen blinked once, twice. "What is this?" she demanded, stepping forward. "Why are you thanking him?" The officer turned toward her, expression firm but controlled. "Ma'am," he said, "this gentleman is not trespassing." Her smile faltered. "That's impossible," she said quickly. "This is HOA property." "No," the officer replied, "it is." Her face drained of color as the words sank in. "But I'm the HOA president," she said weakly, as if the title might still save her. The second officer spoke now, voice calm but final. "HOA bylaws do not override public access to this lake, and you don't have the authority to remove him." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, searching for support, for agreement, for anything. The onlookers were silent now, watching her unravel. "He was harassing me," she tried again, desperation creeping in. The first officer shook his head slightly. "We observed no harassment," he said, "and making false claims is a serious matter." Karen's smirk was gone completely, replaced by panic and disbelief. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered her arms, clipboard slipping against her side. "I was just enforcing the rules," she whispered. "Your rules," the officer said evenly, "don't apply here." The lake was quiet again, but the balance of power had shifted so completely it was almost visible. Karen stood frozen, exposed, realizing for the first time that the authority she'd relied on wasn't real, and that by calling the police, she hadn't summoned reinforcements. She'd summoned witnesses. The badge didn't come out fast. It came out deliberate, slow enough to be unmistakable, controlled enough to leave no doubt about intent. Gold caught the morning light as it cleared my jacket, the seal crisp, official, unmistakably federal. Not a prop, not a novelty. Real authority doesn't rush. It doesn't need to. I held it steady at chest level, angled so the nearest officer could read it clearly before I said a word. The effect was immediate and absolute. The officer's eyes locked onto the badge, pupils narrowing as his entire posture shifted from casual enforcement to formal recognition. His shoulders straightened, his tone changed, his body language snapping into a level of respect Karen had never inspired in her life. "Sir," he said quietly, almost reflexively, "one moment, please." He took a half step back, showing the badge to his partner. They exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but carried weight, the kind that says this situation just crossed a line. Karen was still smiling at first, still riding the high of what she thought was victory. She didn't understand yet. She was still operating in a world where clipboards outranked people and volume replaced law. "What is that?" she asked sharply, irritation creeping into her voice. "Why are you looking at him like that?" I finally spoke, voice even, measured, impossible to twist into aggression. "I don't answer to HOAs," I said, "and this lake falls under federal jurisdiction." The words hit harder than any shout ever could. Karen's smile froze, then cracked, then collapsed entirely. The color drained from her face so fast it was almost frightening. "That's not possible," she said weakly. "This is our community lake." One of the officers turned to her, no longer indulging her tone. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this body of water is federally managed land. Your HOA has no authority here." Karen took a step back, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath her. "But I'm the HOA president," she said again, clinging to the title like a life raft. I lowered the badge slightly but didn't put it away. "Then you should know better," I replied calmly. "Misrepresentation of property authority is a serious matter, so is misuse of emergency services." Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She tried again, still nothing. The officer closest to her sighed softly, the sound of someone who'd seen this before. "Ma'am," he said, "you reported trespassing and harassment. Based on what we've observed and verified, neither occurred." Karen's hands began to tremble. The clipboard she'd carried like a badge of honor slipped slightly in her grip. "I was just enforcing the rules," she whispered, voice suddenly small. "Your rules," the officer replied, "do not override federal law." The onlookers were silent now, the earlier curiosity replaced by something closer to awe. This wasn't a shouting match anymore. This was a correction. The other officer cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to me respectfully, "we apologize for the inconvenience." "No inconvenience," I replied. "Just a misunderstanding that didn't need to escalate." Karen flinched at the word escalate. She looked around wildly, realizing for the first time that every witness she'd summoned had just watched her lose everything she thought she had. "Am I in trouble?" she asked quietly. The officer met her gaze evenly. "That depends," he said, "on whether this behavior continues." He gestured toward the lake. "This gentleman is within his rights to be here. Any further attempts to interfere could be documented." Karen swallowed hard. Her confidence, her bluster, her manufactured authority had evaporated completely, leaving behind only embarrassment and fear. "I didn't know," she murmured. "Ignorance doesn't grant authority," I said, finally slipping the badge back into my jacket, "but it can revoke it." The officers nodded, satisfied the situation was resolved. One gave me a final, respectful glance before turning back to their cars. Karen stood frozen, staring at the lake she'd tried to control, the water calm and indifferent to her collapse. As the patrol cars pulled away and the sirens faded, the morning returned to silence. I picked up my fishing rod, cast my line once more, and felt the ripples spread across the surface. Karen didn't say another word. She didn't look at me again, and she never came back to that lake. Officers turned to Karen at the same time, the way people do when a story has reached the point where evidence matters more than volume. The lead officer's tone was calm, professional, and unmistakably final. "Ma'am," he said, "Do you have documentation showing this lake belongs to the HOA?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Karen's confidence faltered visibly. She blinked, then nodded too quickly. "Of course," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded wrong even to her own ears. "Have all the paperwork." She flipped open her clipboard with shaking hands, papers rustling loudly in the sudden silence. The crowd leaned in slightly. This was the moment where her authority either became real or collapsed completely. She scanned the first page, then the second, her manicured finger tracing highlighted lines that suddenly meant nothing. Her breathing quickened. "It should be here," she muttered, flipping faster now, pages slapping against the metal clip. The officer waited, patient but unmoved. Another sheet, then another, HOA meeting minutes, landscaping guidelines, parking violations, pool hours, fines, warnings, threats, everything except what she needed. Her face began to flush, then pale, then flush again as panic set in. "That's strange," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "I know we have it." The officer glanced briefly at his partner, then back at her. "Take your time," he said evenly, which somehow made it worse. Karen's fingers trembled as she dug deeper, pulling out folded papers, printed emails, even a laminated rule sheet she'd clearly used dozens of times to intimidate neighbors. Nothing, absolutely nothing tying the lake to the HOA. The silence grew uncomfortable. A jogger shifted their weight. Someone coughed. Karen swallowed hard. "It's probably in my car," she said weakly. The officer shook his head slightly. "Ma'am," he replied, "if the HOA had jurisdiction over this lake, that documentation would be registered and verifiable. We've already checked." That was the moment it truly hit her. Her shoulders sagged. The clipboard lowered inch by inch until it rested uselessly against her thigh. "This lake," the officer continued, "is protected land, federally managed. Public access is permitted under federal regulation." He gestured toward me briefly, "which means he is not violating any rules." Karen opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. The words wouldn't come. "There are no HOA permits," the officer added. "No HOA authority, no HOA enforcement rights." Each sentence dismantled another piece of the world she thought she controlled. "But we maintain it," she said desperately. "We clean it, we landscape around it." "Maintenance does not equal ownership," the officer replied, "and it certainly does not grant enforcement power." Karen's eyes darted to me, then away, shame and anger twisting together. "So you're saying," she whispered, "I was wrong?" The officer didn't soften his answer. "Yes, ma'am." He paused, then continued, voice firm. "There's another issue we need to address." Karen stiffened. "You reported trespassing, harassment, and refusal to comply with lawful orders," he said. "Based on the facts, none of those claims are accurate." Her hands clenched around the clipboard again, knuckles white. "I thought," she began. "Additionally," the officer said, cutting in gently but decisively, "you knowingly attempted to enforce authority you do not possess and contacted law enforcement under false pretenses." The crowd murmured now. Karen's breath came in shallow bursts. "I didn't know he was." She stopped herself too late, eyes flicking to my jacket. The officer followed her gaze. "You were also informed," he said, "that this individual is a federal officer." Karen's face drained completely of color. "Which means," the officer continued, "you falsely reported a federal officer performing a lawful activity on federally protected land." The words landed like a physical blow. Karen staggered slightly, catching herself on the edge of the clipboard. "I didn't know," she whispered again, voice barely audible. "Intent doesn't erase consequences," the officer replied. "He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He was simply stating reality. We are documenting this incident." Karen's eyes widened. "Documenting," she repeated, panic finally breaking through completely. "Is that, am I in trouble?" The officer met her gaze steadily. "That depends on whether this behavior continues and whether there are further complaints." He glanced at the lake, then at the witnesses. "For now, you are being formally advised that your HOA has no authority here. Any future attempts to interfere with lawful use of this land could result in penalties." Karen nodded rapidly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I understand," she said quickly. I won't come back here." The officer turned slightly toward me. "Sir," he said respectfully, "thank you for your patience." I inclined my head. "Just wanted to fish," I replied. The simplicity of it seemed to sting Karen more than anything else. The officers stepped away to finish their report, leaving Karen standing alone, exposed, her clipboard suddenly just paper and plastic again. The truth had come out fully now, undeniable and public. Her authority had not been challenged. It had been disproven, and the lake, calm and unmoved, reflected it all without comment. Karen's voice cracked as the officer's words sank in. I didn't know, she stammered, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled papers that had once made her feel powerful. The confidence that had always radiated from her, that aura of control she wielded over the neighborhood, evaporated in an instant. The officer's eyes remained steady, unyielding, a mirror reflecting the reality Karen had refused to see. That's not a defense, he replied, his voice firm but not cruel. There was no need for cruelty. The truth was more than enough to dismantle the fragile authority Karen had constructed around herself. She had believed that her rules, her memos, and her constant patrols of the community gave her dominion over every lawn, every mailbox, every resident's daily life. But in this moment, standing in the harsh light of accountability, she realized that control had been an illusion. From the balconies above, neighbors leaned over, their expressions a mix of shock, relief, and quiet satisfaction. Months of whispered complaints, subtle acts of defiance, and careful boundary testing had led to this inevitable confrontation. Some whispered to each other, barely audible, she finally got what she deserved. Others simply watched, transfixed, unable to believe that the woman who had dictated so many aspects of their lives could be humbled so thoroughly. Her face, usually a mask of authority and certainty, was now pale and streaked with tears, her carefully constructed composure shattered. She was the neighborhood's self-appointed queen, the woman who prided herself on knowing everything that happened within her domain. Yet now she could not even control her own breathing, each inhalation ragged, each exhale trembling with the weight of impending consequences. The officer handed her the citation with a steady hand. False reporting, harassment. The legal language felt clinical, almost distant, yet its implications were devastating. Karen's mind raced, desperately searching for an escape route, a loophole, a shred of justification that might restore even a fraction of her lost dignity. But there was nothing. The evidence was irrefutable. The accounts of neighbors corroborated the story. Surveillance footage, text messages, and prior warnings formed a seamless chain of proof. She had been outmaneuvered not by cunning or luck, but by the simple and inexorable weight of truth. Her eyes darted to the neighbors watching, some nodding subtly, others openly smirking, their collective gaze pressing down on her like a physical force. The realization hit her harder than the officer's words ever could. The power she had wielded so carelessly, the sense of control she had believed absolute, had always been conditional, fragile, and entirely dependent on the fear and compliance of others. Once that fear evaporated, once someone stood firm and refused to bend to her whims, her dominion collapsed like a house of cards. The very neighbors she had monitored, criticized, and reported were now witnesses to her humiliation, their quiet resistance finally manifesting as an unstoppable tide. Karen's mind scrambled for a narrative, a story that could explain away her actions, soften the consequences, or at least redirect the embarrassment elsewhere. But the officer's expression offered no loopholes, no sympathy beyond the professional decorum required of him. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and found that even words failed her. The tightly wound sense of superiority she had cultivated over the years had no defense against reality. She had underestimated the resolve of those around her, failed to recognize that true authority cannot be manufactured through fear, threats, or arbitrary rules. It emerges from respect, fairness, and genuine competence, qualities Karen had consistently ignored in favor of self-serving control. As the citation was processed, Karen's surroundings seemed to shift. The familiar suburban landscape, once a stage for her self-aggrandizing antics, now felt alien. The neatly trimmed lawns, the pastel-colored houses, and even the distant hum of children playing seemed to mock her. Each detail reminded her that control is never absolute, that life has a way of exposing illusions in the most public and humiliating ways. She had treated her neighbors like pawns in a game she believed she controlled, but now the game had turned on her and she had no moves left. Her breathing remained shallow, uneven, as the officer's presence emphasized her vulnerability. The neighbor's attention weighed heavily on her, yet there was no malice, only the quiet satisfaction of those who had endured years of arbitrary scrutiny and petty tyranny. They had learned patience, had waited for the moment when Karen's overreach would be undeniable, and now that moment had arrived. The scales had shifted, and for the first time, Karen understood what it felt like to be powerless. With the citation in her hand, Karen turned, attempting to retreat, but every step felt heavy, as if the weight of her misjudgments and arrogance were pulling her down. Her usual assertiveness had crumbled entirely, leaving behind a woman forced to confront the consequences of her actions without the shield of intimidation. In that instant, she realized that control is not a possession but a responsibility, one that cannot be faked, coerced, or demanded. It must be earned and maintained with integrity, something she had long neglected. The officer gave her one last look, not of triumph but of impartial acknowledgement. The law had been applied, justice had been served, and the neighborhood could finally breathe without fear of her interference. Karen's retreat was slow and unsteady, each step a reminder of the lessons she had ignored, each exhale a fragile attempt to regain composure. Behind her, the community watched, sensing the end of an era marked by petty domination and arbitrary enforcement. Karen, once the undisputed arbiter of her suburban domain, was left to confront a simple truth. No amount of rules, memos, or threats could replace self-awareness, empathy, and humility. Control, she realized too late, is not a right. It is earned, maintained through trust, and fragile when based on fear. And as she disappeared into the background, the neighborhood exhaled collectively, aware that peace had returned not through confrontation alone, but through the undeniable revelation that those who live by intimidation eventually face the day when control slips away. I still fish there every morning, as I have for years, but the atmosphere is no longer charged with tension or fear. The lake, once a stage for petty disputes and the assertion of fragile authority, has become a sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection where the water mirrors the calm of the early dawn sky and the soft rustle of leaves punctuates the rhythm of my thoughts. The air smells of damp earth and fresh water, carrying with it the subtle promise of continuity, of routines uninterrupted by interference or unnecessary confrontation. Occasionally, neighbors join me now, carrying their own fishing gear, cups of coffee, or simply their curiosity. They settle a respectful distance away, sometimes striking up a conversation, asking about the best spots to cast a line, the habits of the fish, or the subtle techniques that make the experience more rewarding. I answer politely, sharing what is needed, but the badge tucked away in my drawer, unseen, is rarely mentioned. It exists only as a silent reminder of what transpired, a tool of last resort rather than a symbol to wield carelessly. Over time, a rhythm has emerged, the gentle casting of lines, the occasional tug of a catch, the murmured encouragements and laughter that now punctuate the mornings. There is an almost sacred quality to this routine, a recognition that control is not about domination, nor about proving superiority over others, but about stewardship, caring for a space, respecting its limits, and knowing when to act and when to step back. The lake, in its quiet persistence, has taught lessons that no confrontation or display of power ever could: patience, observation, and the subtle art of influence without coercion. When the sun rises, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I feel the profound satisfaction of having preserved not only a natural sanctuary, but also the integrity of my own conduct. Power does not come from flashing authority, from intimidating or imposing one's presence on others. That is transient and fragile, collapsing the moment it is challenged or questioned. Real power, I have come to understand, flows from discernment, from knowing when to intervene and when to allow events to unfold naturally, from the quiet confidence that comes with competence and moral clarity rather than the desperate need for recognition or obedience. In this space, surrounded by the gentle lapping of water and the occasional call of a bird overhead, I have witnessed the transformation not only of the lake, but of the community itself. Neighbors who once flinched at arbitrary rules or unnecessary reports now approach with openness, with trust that has been earned slowly, without force or intimidation. Even Karen, whose overreach once dominated the neighborhood, is now a background note, a cautionary tale more than a current concern, and the absence of her interference has created a new kind of harmony. I watch the reflections ripple across the water, seeing not just my own image, but the shared presence of the neighborhood, interconnected yet independent, each person free to move and breathe without fear of judgment or control. There is a profound satisfaction in this, a sense of restoration that transcends the physical act of fishing and extends into the moral and emotional currents of community life. I have learned that authority, when necessary, is most effective when it is invisible, when it undergirds order without demanding attention, and that the measure of strength lies in restraint, in knowing that true influence does not require dominance, but understanding, foresight, and the judicious exercise of one's capabilities. The lake itself seems to echo this lesson, calm and enduring, capable of reflecting storms yet never controlled by them, resilient in its persistence, offering sustenance, beauty, and reflection to those who approach with respect and patience. Each morning, as I bait the hook and cast my line into the glassy surface, I am reminded of the journey that brought me here, the confrontations, the lessons, the fragile moments of tension that taught the value of discretion and the cost of arrogance. And as I sit, watching the small ripples travel across the water, I realize that peace is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the presence of understanding, the quiet acknowledgement that power is best measured not by the reactions it provokes, but by the stability it maintains, the trust it cultivates, and the dignity it preserves, both for oneself and for those around. In this restored space, every catch, every shared smile, every silent morning spent in contemplation is a testament to the enduring truth that control is not seized. It is exercised with wisdom, patience, and the humility to know when it is truly necessary, and that the greatest victories are often those won without confrontation, through quiet perseverance, measured action, and respect for the natural order of things. Here by the lake, surrounded by the subtle symphony of wind, water, and life, I have found not just a place to fish, but a living lesson in power, restraint, and the enduring value of peace, a peace that is both hardened and infinitely rewarding, a testament to the quiet strength that comes from knowing when to act and when to let the world unfold as it must. I still fish there every morning, as I have for years, but the atmosphere is no longer charged with tension or fear. The lake, once a stage for petty disputes and the assertion of fragile authority, has become a sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection where the water mirrors the calm of the early dawn sky and the soft rustle of leaves punctuates the rhythm of my thoughts. The air smells of damp earth and fresh water, carrying with it the subtle promise of continuity, of routines uninterrupted by interference or unnecessary confrontation. Occasionally, neighbors join me now, carrying their own fishing gear, cups of coffee, or simply their curiosity. They settle a respectful distance away, sometimes striking up a conversation, asking about the best spots to cast a line, the habits of the fish, or the subtle techniques that make the experience more rewarding. I answer politely, sharing what is needed, but the badge tucked away in my drawer, unseen, is rarely mentioned. It exists only as a silent reminder of what transpired, a tool of last resort rather than a symbol to wield carelessly. Over time, a rhythm has emerged, the gentle casting of lines, the occasional tug of a catch, the murmured encouragements and laughter that now punctuate the mornings. There is an almost sacred quality to this routine, a recognition that control is not about domination, nor about proving superiority over others, but about stewardship, caring for a space, respecting its limits, and knowing when to act and when to step back. The lake, in its quiet persistence, has taught lessons that no confrontation or display of power ever could: patience, observation, and the subtle art of influence without coercion. When the sun rises, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I feel the profound satisfaction of having preserved not only a natural sanctuary, but also the integrity of my own conduct. Power does not come from flashing authority, from intimidating or imposing one's presence on others. That is transient and fragile, collapsing the moment it is challenged or questioned. Real power, I have come to understand, flows from discernment, from knowing when to intervene and when to allow events to unfold naturally, from the quiet confidence that comes with competence and moral clarity rather than the desperate need for recognition or obedience. In this space, surrounded by the gentle lapping of water and the occasional call of a bird overhead, I have witnessed the transformation not only of the lake, but of the community itself. Neighbors who once flinched at arbitrary rules or unnecessary reports now approach with openness, with trust that has been earned slowly, without force or intimidation. Even Karen, whose overreach once dominated the neighborhood, is now a background note, a cautionary tale more than a current concern, and the absence of her interference has created a new kind of harmony. I watch the reflections ripple across the water, seeing not just my own image, but the shared presence of the neighborhood, interconnected yet independent, each person free to move and breathe without fear of judgment or control. There is a profound satisfaction in this, a sense of restoration that transcends the physical act of fishing and extends into the moral and emotional currents of community life. I have learned that authority, when necessary, is most effective when it is invisible, when it undergirds order without demanding attention, and that the measure of strength lies in restraint, in knowing that true influence does not require dominance, but understanding, foresight, and the judicious exercise of one's capabilities. The lake itself seems to echo this lesson, calm and enduring, capable of reflecting storms yet never controlled by them, resilient in its persistence, offering sustenance, beauty, and reflection to those who approach with respect and patience. Each morning, as I bait the hook and cast my line into the glassy surface, I am reminded of the journey that brought me here, the confrontations, the lessons, the fragile moments of tension that taught the value of discretion and the cost of arrogance. And as I sit, watching the small ripples travel across the water, I realize that peace is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the presence of understanding, the quiet acknowledgement that power is best measured not by the reactions it provokes, but by the stability it maintains, the trust it cultivates, and the dignity it preserves, both for oneself and for those around. In this restored space, every catch, every shared smile, every silent morning spent in contemplation is a testament to the enduring truth that control is not seized. It is exercised with wisdom, patience, and the humility to know when it is truly necessary, and that the greatest victories are often those won without confrontation, through quiet perseverance, measured action, and respect for the natural order of things. Here by the lake, surrounded by the subtle symphony of wind, water, and life, I have found not just a place to fish, but a living lesson in power, restraint, and the enduring value of peace, a peace that is both hardened and infinitely rewarding, a testament to the quiet strength that comes from knowing when to act and when to let the world unfold as it must. Karen thought control came from rules, from the endless lists, memos, and signs she had plastered across the neighborhood, from the ceaseless monitoring of every minor deviation, from the phone calls, complaints, and citations she used as instruments of influence. She believed that authority was measured by how much she could dictate, by how many people flinched when her name was mentioned, by the sheer force of her presence and the weight of her threats. She carried herself with a self-assured arrogance, believing that the walls of her meticulously curated world were impenetrable, that no one could challenge her dominion, and that fear and compliance were interchangeable with respect and leadership. For years, this belief shaped her interactions, dictating her every move and coloring her perception of the neighborhood and its residents. Every minor infraction, whether a misplaced recycling bin or an unsanctioned garden ornament, became a battleground, a chance to assert dominance, to reinforce the fragile empire she had built on rules rather than relationships. She enforced her will with precision, often taking satisfaction in the subtle discomfort she could provoke, the small victories that confirmed her sense of control. Yet the illusion of power, no matter how meticulously maintained, is inherently fragile, and the truth has a way of revealing itself in moments of reckoning. Karen discovered this reality in the harshest of ways, when her assumptions collided with forces far beyond her comprehension and her reach. The lake, a symbol of peace and recreation, had been protected land, governed not by HOA rules, not by her own self-imposed authority, but by federal law, a domain beyond the reach of memos, citations, and personal vendettas. She had miscalculated, overstepped, and in doing so, exposed the limits of her influence. The officers who arrived were calm, professional, and unwavering, their presence a stark reminder that authority grounded in genuine law and principle operates on a plane far removed from petty local domination. Her protests, her papers, her meticulously documented claims, all meant to reinforce her supremacy, crumbled instantly in the face of incontrovertible truth. She was forced to confront the fact that compliance born of fear is not true respect, that rules without moral grounding are meaningless, and that attempting to impose order without understanding its source is an exercise in futility. Standing there, Citation in hand, face pale and hands trembling, Karen experienced a profound and undeniable shift in awareness. The neighbors she had monitored and policed for so long watched silently, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction, relief, and quiet astonishment. The dynamic that had defined the neighborhood for years, the tension, the whispered complaints, the calculated overreach, collapsed under the weight of truth and accountability. Karen realized that control is not about the ability to dictate or the capacity to intimidate. It is about understanding, fairness, and the judicious application of authority when it is truly warranted. She learned, painfully and publicly, that influence built on manipulation and fear is temporary, fragile, and vulnerable to exposure, whereas authority rooted in knowledge, honesty, and ethical grounding endures beyond any single confrontation. The experience etched itself into her consciousness, leaving her shaken but irrevocably enlightened. She had crossed boundaries she did not fully comprehend, intruding on spaces and rights that were beyond her jurisdiction, and in doing so, she had highlighted the distinction between what she imagined to be control and what real governance entails. Some lines, like federal land, like laws designed to protect communities and natural resources, are immutable, not negotiable, and not subject to personal interpretation or desire. Attempting to traverse these lines without understanding their significance is not only futile but perilous, exposing the trespasser to consequences far beyond the simple discomfort of neighborly disapproval. Karen's misjudgment served as a lesson not only to herself, but to everyone who had observed the drama unfold. The boundaries of authority are defined by principle and legality, not by personal ambition, and respecting these limits is essential for maintaining order, trust, and harmony within any community. In the aftermath, as she retreated from the lake and the neighborhood, the weight of this realization hung over her, transforming her perception of power, control, and responsibility. She understood now that the essence of influence is not coercion, not the arbitrary enforcement of rules, but the application of truth, knowledge, and restraint, and that attempts to shortcut this understanding through intimidation or self-aggrandizement ultimately lead to failure, humiliation, and exposure. The community, freed from the pressures of her overreach, experienced a renewed sense of autonomy and cohesion, a subtle but profound restoration of trust, calm, and dignity that can only emerge when arbitrary domination is removed and replaced by genuine order. The lake returned to its natural rhythm, a mirror of the sky and a canvas for reflection as residents resumed their lives, their routines now unhindered by fear or undue oversight. The simple acts of fishing, walking, and observing the natural world became acts of quiet resistance and reclamation, reinforcing the principle that authority must be exercised with wisdom, patience, and ethical grounding, rather than assumed through titles, memos, or intimidation. Karen, confronted with the enduring truth of her own misjudgments, internalized a final, immutable lesson: that control derived from arrogance and fear is fleeting, that respect is earned through integrity and consistency, and that certain boundaries, like federal protections and immutable laws, are sacred and inviolable, impervious to personal interpretation or convenience. As she disappeared from the immediate sphere of the neighborhood, her legacy remained, not as a symbol of continued dominance, but as a cautionary tale, a living reminder of the dangers of misapplied authority and the power of truth to restore balance and order. The residents, meanwhile, moved forward with a collective sense of relief and understanding, carrying with them the subtle but lasting lesson that vigilance and awareness, tempered with patience and respect, are the true foundations of harmony and coexistence. In the quiet aftermath, the lake's surface reflected the morning light, undisturbed by conflict, a serene testament to the enduring principle that real authority is not declared but demonstrated, not demanded but earned, and that wisdom lies not in asserting dominion indiscriminately, but in recognizing the lines that should never be crossed, respecting the laws that govern us, and wielding influence with judicious care, humility, and unwavering adherence to truth.